Welcome to Real Mob Stories. This is your host, James Proctor. Hope everyone's doing well today and had a great Thanksgiving. And today we're going to talk about Paul Vario. I've been doing a lot of research on this guy, and I just want to say that there's a lot of bad things that this guy did. We look at him as some sort of mobster, but to me, he was more of a monster than a mobster. And so when we take a look at his life, we'll see how he got charged and convicted 5 times for taking advantage of women. We'll go through one of them in detail where he actually took advantage with his friends, a woman, actually a 16-year-old teenager. And also when they went to the authorities, he and his friend went and threatened the family. And so there's a lot that I want to talk about regarding, Paul Vario's case. And so a lot that we know is from the movie Goodfellas, but, that's really not the true story. And as I told you when we went through the story of Billy Batts, we really quickly realized how much of a bad narrator Henry Hill was. A lot of what he said was not true and wasn't substantiated. And unfortunately, a lot of people out there have accepted it as gospel when it's not. So anyway, do me a favor and hit the like button. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please consider doing so. Without further delay, on to our feature presentation. So Paul Vario was born in 1914 in Brooklyn. Sicilian parents, and they came to the United States in 1906. And according to what we've read about Paul Vario, it said that he got in trouble when he was 11 years old, and he went into a juvenile detention home for about 7 months. And then as he became a teenager into the 1930s, he started doing a lot of crimes as an associate with the Lucchese's Canarsie crew. So he was involved in robberies, burglaries, and theft. And then in 1932, when he was at the age of 18, it was the first of many of his crimes of, the R word. Then he gets married in 1935 to Vita, and then they moved to Flatlands, Brooklyn. And at the time, the Canarsie crew was led by a guy named Salvatore Corrali, and he was an immigrant from Agrigento, Sicily. But even as a young wannabe gangster in his 20s, Vario was considered an aggressive enforcer type. He was involved in gambling, loan sharking, and dope. And he was a good earner, and he actually had a car by the time he was 21 years old. And then in 1936, when he was 22, that's when he gets arrested for first and second degree R word. And here's a short I did on the incident in question. On September 13, 1936, 22-year-old Paul Vario and 4 of his friends were out and about driving on a Sunday afternoon when they approached 2 teenage girls walking from church in Long Island City, Queens. One of the teenage girls was 17-year-old Frances Graciana, who lived at 50 Fountain Street in Long Island City. The friend of Frances was told to leave while Frances was forced into the vehicle of Paul Vario. They ended up going to a secluded part of Howard Beach on 157th Avenue and 91st Street, where Frances is gang R-word by the 5 of them, where she ends up passing out. Paul and the others are identified and they get charged with the crime of first and second degree. However, on the witness stand, Frances recants and doesn't remember the attackers. It's later found out that Paul and the others threatened to take out Frances and her family if they testified. Paul Vario ends up getting convicted in 1937 of first and second degree R-word and gets sentenced to 10 to 20 years at Sing Sing prison, where he gets paroled a couple of years later. However, Vario violates his parole on 2 occasions and goes back to prison on the same conviction. So what happened was that Frances and her friend Millie were walking home from church when Paul Vario and his 4 friends drove up on the 2 girls. They started talking to them. At some point, the 2 girls got in the car, but Vario wanted the girl Millie to leave, and she was let out at some point. And then Vario and the guys end up driving to a rural part of Howard Beach where Francis is brutally, taken advantage of by these men, these monsters. And it got so bad that Francis actually passed out. And so the police start investigating the case, and Paul Vario and a friend, Anthony Romano, is identified as being, the perpetrator. And there were 3 others that were there as well, but since she passed out, she wasn't sure if those other 3 men had taken advantage of her, but most likely they did. But then during the initial trial, Frances ended up recanting her story. And so a mistrial occurs, and the prosecutors, realize something was amiss. And then they find out that Paul Vario and Anthony had actually went to Frances's parents' house and threatened to take Frances out and her family if she didn't recant. And so there was another trial, and Vario does get convicted on the, first and second degree assaults and gets a 10-year bid. And so back then, you could get out of prison a lot earlier. So, this was a state charge. He went up to Sing Sing, and so I think after about 3 years, he got out of prison, but he keeps on violating his parole. He gets in trouble for, basically stealing. He gets in trouble for robberies. And so he goes in and out of jail, and this process continues from about 1940 to 1962 when he finally, gets off parole. As I said, Vario got married in 1935 to Vita. They had 3 sons, Peter, Paul Jr., and Leonard. And then at some point, believe in the 60s, he divorced Vita and then married a woman named Phyllis. But Vario had a horrible, horrible temper. And here's one story that just, talks about this. It really brings us to light. So Vario had taken Phyllis out to dinner, and they were sitting at the table, and, maitre d' at the restaurant accidentally had spilled some wine on Phyllis's dress. And then, Vario was upset, and then the guy wasn't thinking, and he started to try to dry it with a dirty rag. So Vario's really ticked off, and he hits the maitre d' twice, but then he can't let it go. And later that night, Vario sent 2 carloads of men that had pipes and baseball bats, and they ended up assaulting the waiters after the restaurant had closed. And one of the sons, Leonard, he actually died from severe burns. The cause of the injuries weren't ever discovered, but the problem was at the funeral, they said that 2 television cameramen and a police detective were beaten by people in Vario's crew. So, we know that Vario just couldn't stay out of trouble that long. So in the early 60s, by this time he's a made guy, and I think he moves up to captain kind of in the mid 60s, but you had a Long Island gambler known as Jake Colombo that died, and Vario actually took over his operation. And so he was able to grow this Vario crew to include like the Cedarhurst and Inwood sections, and he started expanding into Nassau County and other parts of Long Island, and he was making serious money at this time. And in 1965, Vario and 8 other men in his crew get arrested on charges that they were running a multi-million-dollar gambling ring, and also they were charged with attempting to bribe a police officer. And so the thing at this time in New York, what was bad was that all of these undercover officers, or a great majority of them, were on the take. And, there was a lot of internal investigations about this, but, the mob was able to pretty much pay off whoever they wanted to, in, local, in the borough and the local government and law enforcement. And so, also in 1966, there's also Nassau County that starts targeting Vario's gambling operations, and this time there's Vario and 17 others that get charged. And according to authorities, they're actually running a bookmaking operation worth $30 million a year. And they, most of the guys were associates, but they said there was a Lucchese soldier named Stephen De Pasquale that was also arrested in that one. And so during this time in the 60s, they saw Vario as this up-and-comer. He was generating a lot of cash for the family. But the problem was he was starting to get a lot of attention. And, he had always been successful in paying off, cops, over the years. But, what you saw is that the NYPD had pretty much gotten rid of most of the old guys that were running the undercover stings and all that, and replaced them with newer guys that weren't necessarily on the take. And, the IRS started getting involved in this because, anytime, there's questions of big money being generated illegally, the IRS wants to see what's going on. And then there was a quirky law, which was kind of interesting, is that one of the charges against Vario was that he was involved in gambling without a federal stamp. And so apparently you had to, if you were going to run a bookmaking operation or a gambling operation legally, you had to procure a $50 stamp. But obviously, in New York, gambling wasn't allowed, in Long Island or New York City. And so, he was getting on the radar with NYPD, with the feds, and also with the IRS. And so the NYPD starts to put bugs in the places that Vario, operates out of. And Vario's pretty much a creature of habit. He really just goes to two different places. There's a Gefkin's bar, which was a more of a German bar that, that he would go to and, drink and whatever. And then he had his auto parts yard. And so usually he was at one of those two places. And so in April of 1972, the NYPD puts a bug there inside the property there at his auto part yard, and they also set up surveillance across the street so they're able to see who comes in and comes out of the property. And so during this 6 months, you had 102 police officers that visited Vario, and many of those people were on the take. And then also you saw a lot of high-profile mob guys that were seen visiting Vario. And so they would, once they would go inside the auto yard, then they would walk out into it and do their walk and talks. They didn't really talk inside the building. And they said that at its height, Vario was earning about $25,000 a day for all of his illegal rackets. And also at the same time, he was leading the rackets out at JFK. And JFK was actually considered open territory, so any of the five families could, do rackets out there. But, we know that it was mostly Lucchese's, Gambinos, and to a point, I believe Bonanos that had done some rackets out and, out at the airport, JFK. So anyway, in October 1972, police officers raid Vario's junkyard, which is in Canarsie. And then a couple of weeks later, there's like a huge operation that takes place. You have 1,200 police officers going all across New York City, Westchester, Nassau, Suffolk counties, and they're delivering hundreds of subpoenas on different mafia members and associates. And this just, this really looked bad for Vario because, a lot of these guys, weren't even known until they got caught on tape by, the surveillance there at the junkyard in Canarsie. And also what you was seeing within the FBI at this time is that J. Edgar Hoover had died earlier that year, and he was always against all of the operations against the mob, and there was a couple of reasons for it. Obviously there were those rumors that the mob had something on J. Edgar Hoover, but also Hoover he was more of a statistics person. He was always looking to see what cases that he could get that were easy, that he could be able to solve quickly, and it would be able to make his numbers look good for Congress. It's kind of a weird situation. So, the thing was that racketeering and mob activities, those are harder to, they're usually longer lasting operations. They're more involved, and he didn't want to, take the time or take the risk. One of the things was he was concerned maybe some of his agents would end up, being on the take. So anyway, with Hoover gone, dying, the FBI put more of an emphasis again on, mob activity. And so in November that year, Vario gets indicted on tampering with a witness. He also gets indicted on insurance fraud charges. Apparently, he and some co-conspirators had stripped a boat of its equipment, sunk it, and filed a $7,000 insurance claim. And then in December, he was indicted on charges that he attempted to bribe, a police officer at the trailer. And then he also gets a DWI for drunk driving. And so just things go from bad to worse for him. And he violates his probation. And so in April of 73, Vario gets sentenced to 6 years in prison, fined $20,000. And Vario is sent to Lewisburg Penitentiary. And this was where, if you remember in the movie Goodfellas, where you see all the people cooking in prison, they have the feast and cooking the pasta and all that. That was supposed to have happened, at Lewisburg. And so it was true. There were a lot of mob guys there at Lewisburg. Vario was with the guy Johnny Dio Guardi. That was a guy that ran a lot of the labor rackets for the Lucchese's. Vinny Alloy, the Columbos was there. Henry Hill was there, actually, at that time. And I believe Jimmy Burke was serving at a different prison. But there at Lewisburg, they were having it pretty good. Food and liquor were smuggled in with the help of the guards. They said that Vario probably only ate in the cafeteria with the rest of the inmates maybe 4 or 5 times. And so in 1975, Vario was able to successfully appeal his sentence and gets released from prison. But things had changed by this time. So at this point, Anthony Corallo was the boss of the Lucchese family. Vario still had a lot of legal restrictions. You know, he couldn't be around other people with felonies. And so Vario ends up moving to Miami. And this tends to reduce Vario's influence with the family because he was looked at as an underboss. He had a lot of power before he went to prison, but really what hurt Vario's standing with the Lucchese family was the Operation Go Bug, which was the operation where, you know, all those mobsters were caught on tape and wire there at Vario's junkyard. And then, you know, going to, you know, just continuing to get in trouble like he did, you know, the DWI, all that type of stuff there, you know, in 1972, you know, it just started to, you know, look bad upon Vario. And so he still was a capo regime and all that, still had his crew there, but it was just, his influence was just not there with Anthony Tony Ducks Corallo. And so in 78, this was when we had the infamous Lufthansa heist. Vario did approve his crew's participation in it. The idea was presented to Vario by phone while he was in Florida. And then what's interesting, Jimmy Burke was actually in prison at the time, but he still was able to supervise it. And so what was happening was Jimmy Burke was allowed out during the day to work. He actually had a kind of a legit job at the time, but he was also using that time during the day to meet with, people to plan out the heist. And then he had to go to a halfway house in the evenings, at least for, a few months. And then in December 1978, that was the heist. They said it was approximately $5 million in cash and then almost $1 million in jewelry. Vario's, staying down in Florida, and then in 1984, he gets pinched again, this time for fraud. He was defrauding the federal government. Also, in this case, in 84, Henry Hill had already became a informant. And so, basically, Hill testified against Vario. And so in this trial, Hill had testified that Vario had arranged like a restaurant job for Hill so he could be released from prison, but there wasn't really any work that he was doing. So it was basically a no-show restaurant job, when Hill got out in 1978. And so anyway, Vario got convicted of defrauding the federal government with that, and he got 4 years in prison and a fine. And then in 1985, the next year, while serving that prison sentence, Vario got a racketeering conspiracy charge and an extortion charge. They were saying that he and the co-conspirators were extorting over $350,000 from air cargo companies at JFK Airport, threatening them with labor problems if they didn't pay the money. Again, he gets convicted, and again with the help of Henry Hill. And this time, Vario got a 10-year sentence, and then this was for extortion. So this was, I believe, in 85. So at this point, Vario will never see, a day on the outside of prison. Vario's health is getting bad at this point. He turned 70 at this point, and a couple of years later, in 1988, he gets, it's found out that he has lung cancer. And so, it's, I believe it's stage 4 lung cancer. He starts to have respiratory failure, and he's moved to the Fort Worth Federal Prison, medical prison, but ends up dying May 3rd, 1988. And then his body's then flown to St. John's Cemetery for, his burial. So that's really the life of Paul Vario. He is definitely a horrible guy. I just can't get over what he did to the 16-year-old girl, him and, his friends. What real man would do that to a teenager? It's just horrible. Just to me, he's a monster, not a mobster. But, a lot of people don't realize that part of Paul Vario's life. And, there's also been questions, did he actually do the R word to Henry Hill's wife? I don't know. We don't really have any evidence that happened. I mean, I know, Vario was a horrible person, but, there's a good chance that did not happen. That might have been made up by Henry Hill, as he made up probably 80% of everything in the book Wise Guy. Let me know your thoughts on that. What do you think of Paul Vario? Did you know about these convictions for the R word? 5 times being convicted of that. What do you think of Henry Hill? How his story, is based upon mostly lies. So anyway, like I said, do me a favor, hit the like button. Please subscribe to the channel, and we'll be back soon. Until next time, take care, stay safe, and God bless you always.